I personally have a general question to both three presentation. Obviously, Matthew is not here, so it will be Daniel and Amal. Um, how in your opinion, how far do you see these sorts of research output to be practically adopted in design practices with regards to any stage of design from inception, conceptual, or in detailing? Do you see any possible near future applications?
I've, since Amal is here, I might be able to respond from my own perspective. I felt to if implement visual complexity and the effects on disruption on time perception can be applied in design in a very final stages regarding to the detail of what they actually see. It could be something involved in the interior design. But what needs to be aware is that this time disruption is involved with quantitative load, and quantitative load is highly interpretive. So sometimes design is very hard to control what the user will actually interpreting of what they see. So I would suggest it can only work in extreme level, like extreme high capacity and extreme low visual capacity to control time perception if designer would like to use this as a tool in the architectural design.
I see. Um, what do you find like from a practical point of view? What do you find the most suitable stage of design process where your kind of research can be most effective? Because I think from a kind of general point of view, there is a normal process in design where you look at the arrangement in the space, and you look at the physical kind of constraints, and you try to optimize your resources and stuff to into design. But I think nobody, at least not the practices that I know, nobody kind of works on designing perception. Nobody works on designing a mental image, because there are certain mental images of space that architects are trained with. But nobody usually goes into the other way around. They design a space and they assume it would have a mental image. But nobody goes the other way. How do you see to reverse? Is this possible?
I think by understanding what the user or participant actually being affected for the level of visualization being simplified. So it will help the designer to understand what type of details would actually have effect of the users. But it means that they will have to constantly checking and develop some kind of tool to analyze whether these kind of details are relevant to the user. Again, but this is very interpretive. So it can be used as a tool, but if the architects really want to play with time perception with the users, it will have to plan ahead in the rather early stage. That would be something I imagine in the perspective of the architectural design process.
I see. Are there any other questions for discussion or?
I have a quick question for Daniel. In respect to cognitive signals, so you have vision there and the complexity of the space, or the complexity of the elements you have in that space, right? Did you look at other cognitive signals, for example, sound or smell and also there is a degree of lighting conditions that would have an impact, and how they compare.
Totally agree that could be the possible direction to expand the investigation. For the purpose of this research, it has to be highly controlled. So that's why even images eliminate the color aspect to avoid possible semantic relation to color from different culture, because my participants come from different background. So for the research purpose, it has to be one control environment to find out one parameter, how it affects the time perception. But again, when the parameter is mixed, it could have different effects. So the reality of understanding the entirety of how visual and or three-dimensionality, movement, smell, light, brightness, all these parameters put together to work out the fundamental principle of how we affect our condition, it would be a lot more complicated. But at the moment, we're just able to break it into one parameter at a time to research.
Right, yeah, so you avoid confounding variables, right? You look at one specific thing, and that's great. It's just like there is a tradition for, certainly for space and memory, you know, in ancient Greece and the Middle East and China, the way they decorate buildings or the way they construct their gardens are somewhere designed for you to remember things as an instrument for remembering, etc.
Yes.
You know, like memory palaces and so on. So I just wonder if, yeah, you know, if you're planning to carry on this research with other signals. Also, there are some devices in nature for changing our perception. So we know there's, for example, a very interesting example is that certain things, even though they don't have sugar, they have very little sugar, they taste sweet. And that they don't taste sweet because they have another chemical that tastes sweet, but because they release a particular chemical that when you smell it, it will temporarily change your taste perception. And
Yes.
a very common plant that does this to us is like tomatoes, yeah? So tomatoes, they have a particular chemical in their smell that changes how your taste bud behave temporarily. And it's just so intriguing. So I just wonder if there are other things like that. We know that certain smells will change your perception of basically your framing of a place. You know, because places have certain smells. You frame and your mindset changes a little bit because it has that particular smell and so forth. So it's just a very fascinating piece of research. So yeah, if you can just talk a little bit more how you so your agenda. You already said that, but if you plan to kind of what's the next step?
Currently, I'm interested into, because the material I use is a still image. I'm planning for the further research to move into videos or dynamic environments that involve changes. Because still image complexity, we know how it affects our condition, but changes in complexity and changes in images will have a different dimensionality on how impact on us. Then if you have to take it further, then it will be three-dimensionality and body movement and affordance that will involve VR environments to test out how we also affect our time perception. So that's quite a lot more possibility for me to explore in the future. Hopefully I'll be able to do that.
Right. And Tristan, I know you're here, and I'm amazed you are awake at this time. Are you in Sydney?
No, I'm in Perth, so
Okay.
it's almost 11 p.m.
Oh, okay. Oh, not too bad then.
Not as bad.
Yeah, so I thought the presentation was super interesting. It, in a sense, was a little bit misplaced. It maybe should be in the algorithm session, on the earlier session. But I thought that we're going to talk more about, how does it have an effect, how like accommodate environments like Sparkle have an effect on the output of design. But yeah, that is my question for you. So when you have that traceability, version control, etc., and when you can isolate parts of the design, etc., how do you see this having an effect on design output from the cognitive perspective?
Oh, it's a great question. I think it's interesting how this did sit in this space because, and the earlier question about, I guess practice, because I think the research is born out of practice, out of, I guess, what happens when, we do engage with subject matter experts who are deeply kind of engaged in their own expertise as engineers, linear infrastructure in particular, and the ways that they describe the things they design and the geometry and how often the more typical computational design methods that we're more familiar with are challenged in a sense. And I guess talking to your point, to share kind of, whether it's to share models, to share algorithms, to share scripts, to share these kinds of things between people in an organization such as ours, the complexity of those things, the complexity of the code or the definitions actually has a massive impact in how the ultimate designer, who often isn't super literate in this stuff, how they can actually engage with that work, and the affordances that they have to make better decisions. So we're seeing with Speckle, obviously as a collaborative tool, but then also with this notion of, rather than try to create complex definitions that approximate a very specific type that is very familiar to an engineer, if we are actually able to design our own geometry kind of engines that describe those types exactly as an engineer expects them to be described, then we can actually have them provide the engineer or designer with far more agency in how they can interact with those things, and to do so through things like Speckle, and I guess this is something that Matthew and I and our team talk about a lot, is it's less about the actual tool itself and more about the interface. And the types of interfaces actually have a massive impact in how a designer is able to actually use those things and thinks about those things. And I think we're still doing a lot of work in that. We're designing a lot of systems that look to not just try to find better ways of interfacing or providing affordances for designers to use these tools, but creating maybe new types of interfaces so that the tools that are exposed to engineers are very specific to their disciplines, very specific to the way that they work, specific to the way that they think. So the example that Matthew showed of that linear infrastructure tool, which rather than trying to view it through geometry, to view it as a timeline, because that's the way engineers think about linear infrastructure. So we kind of tried to flip things around and go, well, that's actually fantastic. The way that, let's actually try to build an interface that is specific to your use and the way that you think about this design process.
Right. Yeah. So you're saying that, for example, if you're dealing with a rail project, you will be dealing with linear infrastructure, right? Linear geometry that expands to a great deal geographically. And then what people use in rail is usually a snake grid structuring of that linear infrastructure. So you're saying that, for example, if you try to do this in, let's say, Revit, you cannot adopt snake grid. I don't think you can also adopt it in MicroStation, Bentley MicroStation, out of the box. But you do need that notation in order to make sense of the track in respect to the geography of the site. So there is a geographic architecture that needs to be developed, and that uses Snake Grid description. So you're saying that the accommodate environment should give us freedom to adopt those different tools.
Yeah.
In respect to the project you're dealing with, or in respect to anything, if you just want to play with the different methodologies, modeling methodologies.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that tool in particular does is it allows a designer to shift between, you know, the Snake Grid is used for it, but yeah, the way that we, you know, to shift between this kind of alignment chainage kind of approach to design into three-dimensional geospatial and back again, and kind of, you know, not being limited to a single approach. But we see that as an opportunity to consider how that might look in other disciplines as well, who have their own languages of design and their own ways of kind of understanding, you know, their disciplines. So because we found that quite interesting. We found that because there are these tools now that take away or that provide so much out of the box, like Speckle, that they're managing the display pipeline stuff. They're managing a lot of the stuff that, you know, a decade ago just was very difficult. So because that is being handled, we're able to spend more time thinking about the geometry kernels, the geometry libraries, the functions behind it, you know, building more robust engines to understand those specific types of esoteric types, as Matthew described, but that are actually built for those disciplines.
Right, it's very interesting. I find this intriguing. I'm finishing editing a book and also writing a chapter in a book for blockchain technologies in the built environment, and my chapter is about accommodate environments for mega projects and how blockchain will have an impact on that. So I'm talking about the data provenance and traceability, and that's one problem. And the one thing I came across that I think is super interesting is that we do have proprietary accommodate environments for project delivery, and they are great. You know, you have things like a Bentley ProjectWise, Autodesk Construction Cloud, and so forth, BIMX, and so on. And in some countries in Europe, at least, there is this idea that infrastructure data is too important to be vendor locked in one accommodate environment, and that interoperability is very important. And I believe that blockchain can only solve part of that problem with data provenance and data immutability, and you wouldn't typically use blockchain or distributed ledger to store data. That data needs to be somewhere else. But there is a thinking emerging, especially in France, Italy, and in the Netherlands, to have accommodate environments as a public service. Yeah. And that's fascinating. And to your point on exotic geometries, this is particularly interesting in the case of Italy. So I was quite fortunate, like last year, my brother came over to visit me here in London, and we went to spend, and my niece, the three of us, we went to spend a couple of days a week actually, in Florence. So we did fly to Bologna and took the high-speed train to Florence. And we took a local train to Pisa. And the high-speed train service in Italy is excellent, in my opinion. It works extremely well. And they have a accommodate environment for BIM development and CAD development for railways in Italy, specifically for railways. And that accounts for some of this exotic modeling. For example, Snake Grid, if you need to have that, and so forth. Yeah. Or like if you're modeling timetables, if you have models like in RailSeas, for example. And that's super nice. We do not have that in the UK. We do not have it in the UK. And I think it's something we need. But I just wonder, in your opinion, because you mentioned speckles, speckle a few times, I'm just wondering if we need yet another accommodate environment out there, or we need something that is backed by the national government. So therefore, we can guarantee by multilateral agreements that data will be like the government, who at the end of the day probably will own that asset, will also own that data.
Yeah, I think
my question is, and I'm diverging quite a lot, what is your political position in that respect?
I think you need both. So, I mean, obviously, you'd be familiar with, this kind of open AEC data thing that's, emerging, and there's been some, the open AEC specification, which I think has several kind of, quite large practices kind of backing it. I think Grimshaw are there, and etc. It's very building centric. So, they say AEC, but really what they mean is the built environment. So it leaves, so it leaves, organizations like ours at Aurecon, leaves us out in the cold a little bit, because we're like, okay, fantastic, but what about, infrastructure, which is operates at a very different scale. But I think you need both, but I think what you need is you're absolutely right. Governments, these assets, these are critical assets. They need to have continuity. It needs to be an open standard. But I think also it needs that open standard that is well documented, and thus the connectors can be built. And that's why I like Speckle, and why we've been attracted to Speckle, even though obviously in delivery it's project wise, it's ACC, it's etc. But things like Speckle provide that flexibility, provide us the ability to connect into all of those spaces, and manage that translation, so that inside our organization we can ensure that the tools that we use and the geometry that we use and the way it's defined and described is matches or accords with the way that the business works, and the way that the business needs to work, and different client requirements, and can be customized and built to meet different client requirements. But ultimately, I think you're absolutely right. There's an imperative that there should, whether it's nations themselves, or it's even more kind of universal, we need to have these particularly these assets. I think it's something that is far more robust and resilient than any single vendor.
So I believe so. So very, very interesting. I think it's it's a huge opportunity. I mean, it's an absolutely huge opportunity to change how we go about developing the built environment and dealing with problems like climate change, avoiding all the waste that happens in the built environment, and maximizing asset management and so forth. The story that comes after you build the asset. And it starts to step into the world of digital twins and so on. So it's quite interesting to see platforms that orchestrate all that data for this. Right. So I think it's like we are 5 people now, I believe, and we crazy late in the day. We almost 1 hour late. So we're gonna, I believe, draw a line and call it a day. Sepeth, are you happy with that?